Hello, Sarah of SEK Handmade here, and I am excited to be here today to talk to you about yarn substitution. If you are a yarn crafter, I think, or at least in my personal experience, yarn substitution is just part of the game. Whether the yarn used in the design is more expensive than you would like to spend on that pattern or than you can afford, or if the yarn is unavailable in your area, or I often found if I picked up a book with a pattern in it that I wanted to make, that yarn might be discontinued if the book was more than a year or so old. Whatever the reason, it's almost impossible for you to go your entire yarn crafting life without needing to substitute yarn. If the thought of making those yarn substitutions overwhelms you or brings up past instances when you have tried to substitute yarn and it has not ended well, friends, you are not alone. I think that some in the yarn community have done a bit of a disservice by really oversimplifying yarn substitution, which makes those of us who try those oversimplified methods and it fails, it makes us feel like we are the failure. And you are not. And so today I want to give you lots of different things to think about when you're substituting yarn so that you can make the very best substitutions possible. The goal of I'm going to go deeper here. I was going to say of yarn substitution, but I think it's even deeper than that. The goal of our handcraft is to make a finished product that you love. I think when we get into the nitty-gritty of the details of patterns, or if we're being challenged by a new technique, it's easy to get in the weeds about those things and forget the big picture of, do I love what I'm making? And if the answer is no, then why are we doing it, right? This is our hobby. It's supposed to be something we enjoy and love. And I'm not saying you're never going to get frustrated or that you should give up at the first sign of resistance. But what I am saying is that as we work, I would love myself and all of us to keep our enjoyment and our joy at the forefront so that we can always make sure that we're using yarns we love and making projects that we will really love. Keeping that in mind, we also need to understand that designers most often pick the yarns they use for a design for a specific reason. And it's not usually the reasons I used to pick yarns for making things when I first started out. I will tell you the reasons I picked yarns when I first started out was they were affordable, they were in my budget, and I liked the color. I thought it was pretty, which are great and important things to keep in mind. But most often designers pick yarn for the drape, for the way that the colors will play with the stitches, not just because it's a pretty color, but will the yarn that I'm choosing show off the stitches, or do I want a more variegated yarn because it's simple stitches and that'll really show off the colors in the yarn. So we need to keep in mind that designers aren't picking yarns just out of the air. There are reasons behind their decisions, and that the further we move away from the yarn they chose, the less our final project is likely to look and behave like the design. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that I think is so often overlooked, and this is going to seem silly for me to mention, but I think it's really important because it's obvious, but it gets forgotten. Friends, we are humans. We have human hands. Our human hands are affected by our mood, the temperature of the air around us, if we are in pain. And so if you pick the exact same yarn as the designer, you still may end up with a slightly different final product. And that is because you are not a machine. We go into stores and see things that look perfectly uniform because they are made by machines. We cannot expect those same things from us. And I think the human factor is a big part of what makes Handmade so, so special. So keeping in mind that A, the designer picked the yarn for a reason, B, you are human, and C, that you really want to love your final product, I really, really want to encourage you, I'm going to say the thing you hate, to swatch. No matter what yarn you choose for a substitution, a swatch is key to knowing if that yarn is going to be a good substitution before you dive into a big project. As I said before, yarn substitution is a more complex topic than it is often thought to be. And that's why yarn substitutions can sometimes fail, is because we forget to think about all the things that make up making a good choice for yarn substitution. So I have 5 things that I'm going to share with you to keep in your mind every time you go to substitute yarn. The first thing you need to think about when making a yarn substitution is yarn weight. I have said it before and I will say it again. Yarn weight is like women's jean sizes. You can walk into a store, pull on a size 12, and it can fit you like a glove. You can go into the next store, pull on a size 12, and barely get it over your ankle. Yarn weights give the illusion that everything that is called a worsted weight is the exact same and totally interchangeable for any other worsted weight yarn, and that is simply not the case. Yarn weights denote a range of yarn weights, and while they are similar and those yarns don't vary super vastly, if you pick a very light worsted, whereas the designer used a heavier worsted weight yarn, that can make a very different fabric and can make your meeting gauge be a really big challenge. So when it comes to yarn weight, simply picking up any old yarn with the same weight designation is not going to be enough. Now, I am going to teach you the comparison tool that I used when I very first started doing my own yarn substitutions. This is a simple tool, but it is not a golden ticket, and it was my stumbling block when I started. I thought if I did this simple equation, it was good enough and all my yarn substitutions were going to be perfection. That is not the case, but it is a good starting point. So I want to give you this tool to tuck away in your tool belt. I'm talking a whole belt of tools here, not just one multi-use. So keep in mind that this is a starting point, but not a full and comprehensive solution to yarn substitution. So to get your weight of yarn to be similar to the weight of yarn used in the design, the first thing you need to know is the length and the weight of the original yarn. So I like to work in yards and grams. If you like to work in meters and ounces, totally cool. You can use whatever combination of those you prefer. I'm going to talk yards and grams here. So if you have a skein of, if you're starting a project, let me get my words straight here. If you are starting a project and you look at the yarn given in the pattern and you have decided, I'm not going to use that yarn for whatever reason, you need to find the length of the yarn, so yards is what I choose, and the weight of the yarn in grams. If this is not listed in the pattern, but the type of yarn is listed, go to the internet, find the yardage and the grams. And what I do is I take the number of yards divided by the grams. So let's say I have a pattern and it calls for a yarn that has 450 yards for 100 grams. I'm going to take the 450 and divide it by 100. That gives me 4.5. So there are 4.5 yards per gram. So then let's say I go to my local yarn store and I pick up a skein of yarn that has 440 yards per 100 grams. Keeping this math simple for my brain here, but the reason this formula is helpful is that you may pick up a skein that has 50 grams in it instead of 100, and then the comparison is not quite so straightforward. So the original yarn in the design had 450 yards per 100 grams. I took 450 divided by 100, that gives me 4.5. If I go to my local yarn store and there is 440 yards for 100 grams, that gives me 4.4. Those numbers are pretty close. But if you are comparing, the further those numbers get apart from each other, the bigger the difference in the yarn weight. Now, this is not, like I said, a golden ticket. How a yarn is spun can play into, I guess I should say, into that ratio. And so if you do this, if you go to your local yarn shop and you find yarn that has the exact same ratio, but it doesn't end up swatching up like you feel like it should, it might have to do with how the yarn was spun. So it's not you, it's that this process is not perfect. Ideally, best case scenario, it would be great to get your hands on the original yarn. So let's say this pattern uses a very expensive yarn, and you can go to your local yarn shop and you can see and touch and feel the yarn, and have with your eyes an idea of the actual physical characteristics of that yarn. That would be great. Even if you end up ordering something online or going to, your box craft store to make your substitution, having that visual of it, I find really helps me make a better substitution. But worst case scenario, look the yarn up online, get an idea of the statistics at the very least, and use those to compare. The second thing you really need to think about when making yarn substitution is fiber content. And this was something that was not even kind of on my radar when I very first started making yarn substitutions. But fiber content plays a huge role in how a yarn works up and how the final product behaves. Certain yarns tend to be more drapey and flowy. Some yarns kind of spring back to their original shape. When you block, they can be very springy. Other yarns can be really stiff. So my advice is stay as close to the original fiber content as possible. So if you find a scarf that you want to make, and the scarf is calling for a yarn that is, let's say, 60% wool, 40% acrylic. If you can find a yarn that is very close to the same weight with those exact same percentages, that would be a really great start to a good substitution. But even if you are somewhat off, maybe say it has more acrylic than wool instead of wool than acrylic, that could still be a good fit. Even if you go all the way, okay, so that yarn had more wool than acrylic. If you go all the way and get a 100% wool, that would actually maybe be a better fit than going 100% acrylic, because acrylic and wool can behave very differently. And going more towards the side of the most fiber content, your yarn is going to behave, or is, I should say, more likely to behave like the yarn used in the design. This is a great place to, if you have the opportunity to see and touch the yarn, to really get your hands in there and feel the skein. You can kind of get an idea of how stiff or flexible a yarn is when you feel the skein. You can also look at really other important things like ply and texture. But having an idea of how stiff or flexible the yarn is can really help you make a good substitution. If you substitute fibers within the same, I'm going to call them a family. So if you substitute a wool for an alpaca, that can seem like a really good substitution because, I mean, they're both animals, right? And generally speaking, animal fibers behave more similarly, and synthetic fibers behave more similarly to each other, and plant fibers behave more similarly to each other. However, there are variations, and actually alpaca, 100% alpaca, is not a great substitution for 100% wool. The fibers just behave differently. The further away you go from the designer's original fiber content, the less likely your final product is to be exactly like the designers. And that may be something that you're okay with. Say you see a crocheted top, a summer top, and it was made in wool, and you think, I don't want a summer top in wool. I'm going to make it in bamboo. That's great if you can meet gauge with that bamboo fiber. But do keep in mind that the way you care for that top and the way that it drapes and stretches is going to be significantly different than the top that was made with wool. So if you find that you have changed fiber content significantly in the past and been surprised by the results, it's simply because different fibers behave very differently when they're worked up and when they're worn, and when and how they're blocked. So fiber content is the next most important thing to getting the yarn weight as similar as possible. All right, my third suggestion and my last kind of physical characteristic of yarn that I want you to keep in mind when you are making a yarn substitution is I want you to think about the ply of the yarn and the texture of the yarn. Both ply and texture can play a large role in how the yarn works up and what your final product will look like. Yarns can be processed differently, and that's going to be the point at which making that simple math comparison of length to weight is going to be thrown off, because if the yarns are spun differently, one way of spinning leaves a lot of air in the yarn, making it a very fluffy and lightweight yarn, and another type of spinning makes a much more dense yarn. And so comparing those weight to yardage is not going to be an easy comparison. But you also want to consider the plies. Now, plies are simply how yarns are wrapped together. I'm trying to see if I can find a yarn that has some plying that you can see. Okay. If you look carefully at that yarn, just one strand of the yarn, you can see that that's not just one piece of yarn, but it's a couple pieces that have been twisted together. That is the ply. Let's see if I can get this one close enough for you to see. If you look at, let me pick that little guy up. If you look at this yarn very carefully, you can see there's no twists, and that's because this yarn is a single ply. A single ply and a double ply are going to look different when they're worked up. They are going to behave slightly differently in the final product, and they're going to wear very differently. The plying of yarn gives it strength. So if you are making a pair of socks, say, and the designer uses a 3-ply and you use a single ply, the end result may look a little different, but it's also going to wear very differently. So that's important. So if you can get an eye or some statistics on the plies of the yarn, that can be another important place to stay consistent with the original yarn used for the design. Because again, a lot of designers will pick their yarn based on what is best for the type of design they've made. Now, I want you to also think about the texture of the yarn. If you have a bulky yarn that is nice and smooth, that is not going to work up the same as a bulky yarn that is, say, like a boucle or a tweed. Those things have extra textures in them, and while sometimes those substitutions can be just fine, I think you will find that if you are exchanging a more textured yarn for a yarn that was very smooth, it's really gonna muddy the stitch definition, which may be totally fine to you, but it's definitely something to be aware of. And know that if you're swatching a yarn that has a really different texture to it, and you're struggling, that may be the thing that you need to change up to find a better fit. The number 4 thing you should think about when making a yarn substitution does not have to do with the physical characteristics of the yarn, but with yarn availability. Oh my goodness, you guys, let me tell you the tears that have been spilled over not considering this. Substitution, and just even if you don't substitute, because again, we're all human, you can meet gauge spot on and still end up using a little more or a little less yarn than is suggested in the pattern. That is normal. That is not some crazy thing. It has to do with the human factor. But when you make a yarn substitution, especially, substituting yard for yard, it's not an exact science. So you need to think about the availability of the yarn that you're substituting. Can you get more of that yarn if you run out? That's an important consideration. The other thing to consider is, can you return yarn if you end up, I personally, it is my preference to buy extra yarn and return if I don't use it, than to be scrambling if I run out of yarn. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen people on Facebook groups or Instagram begging, does anybody know anybody who has one more skein of this yarn that has been discontinued and I can't buy anywhere online, that they'd be willing to ship me from their stash so I can finish my sweater, my baby blanket, my whatever, you know. I always prefer to err on the side of extra yarn than not enough yarn, because like I said, that substitution is not an exact science and you may need more yardage than what is listed in the pattern. The other thing to think about is dye lot. If you have purchased from an indie dyer, especially, all the yarn that comes out of the exact same pan is not going to be exactly the same, let alone if you purchase from them and then they re-dye the yarn and purchase again. But that is even the case with big companies. Let me see. I gotta have a yarn around here. Aha! Yes. Look, it's the same thing I made my scarf. If you look right there, it has a lot number. That is the dye lot, and all of the yarn in that dye lot has been dyed at the same time, which means it's all the same color. As dyeing techniques have improved and industrialized, buying from a bigger company like We Crochet or Lion Brand, you're fairly likely to get the same color even if they're not the same dye lot. But man, have I been burned with a sweater that like 90% of it is exactly spot on the same color because it all came from the same dye lot. And then I had to run back out to Joann's and buy one more skein to finish out the bottom of my sweater. And the color is slightly different because it's not from the same dye lot. So as you're purchasing a large quantity of yarn, check the dye lots. And sometimes if I think I might be cutting it close and I don't want to buy extra yarn, I will rifle through the bin at Joann's or wherever and see, do they have more of this dye lot? So if I have to come back in a few days and buy more, I can. So dye lots are definitely something to consider. The other thing, if the answer is no, if you are pulling from your stash and you just have 5 balls of this and that's all you're willing to have, the other question to ask yourself then is, are you willing to modify the pattern? Are you willing to make it a short sleeve sweater instead of a long sleeve sweater? Are you willing to make it a crop instead of a full length? Are you willing to make that blanket a throw blanket instead of a queen size blanket? So if you can't get more, are you willing to modify? Or another thing to think about is, would you be willing to throw in some sort of contrasting yarn as like a feature if you ran out and couldn't get more? The last thing to think about as you're making a yarn substitution is yardage. Friends, have you ever opened up a pattern? I find this to be more common in books or publications like magazines, but have you ever opened up a pattern and it says, we used Stroll fingering weight yarn, and for the size 1 you will need 6 balls, for the size 2 you'll need 6 balls, for the size 3 you'll need 7, for the size 9 you'll need 10. Instead of listing the yardage you need for each size, it's listed how many balls of yarn you will need. It is easy to get tricked up, especially when it's listed in skeins or balls instead of yards or meters. It's easy to get tripped up on how much yarn you need. And if you're making a yarn substitution, because of all the factors I just talked about in number 4, you're going to want to make sure you get enough yarn. So what you need to do is, if your pattern lists the amount of yarn you need in balls or skeins, you need to either use the information they give you about that yarn or use the internet to find the statistics on how many yards are in a ball of yarn. So this ball of yarn has, I'm going to turn on my calculator here, has 231 yards. So let's say my project said I needed 3 skeins of this yarn. So I would take 231 times 3, which gives me 693 yards of yarn. If this were me personally, I'd just round that up to 700 and call it good. So let's say I pick up, how about this one? This is a different fingering weight yarn. So let's say they've used this and I want to use some hand-dyed yarn I already have in my stash. So this yarn is 400 yards per skein. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, like I said, I'm going to round up. I'm going to take that 700 yards and divide it by the 400 yards that are in the yarn I'm substituting. And that tells me that I need 1.75 skeins of this type of yarn in exchange for the number of balls they used of this type of yarn. Now, can you buy 1.75 skeins? No. So you always round that number up. If you are adventurous and that number was more like 0.2 or 0.1, you could risk it and round down and hope that you have enough yardage. But personally, I really like to round up. Super important to make sure that you have the correct yardage and don't just go saying 3 balls of this means 3 balls of this, because I would have ended up with a whole extra skein of yarn, which when you're buying hand dyed, that's a significant investment. So keep yardage in mind as you're substituting yarn too. Friends, I'm a little embarrassed to admit that when I started out, I was embarrassed by my lack of knowledge, so much so that I did not seek out help with yarn substitution. And what I want, if you get nothing else out of this video, I want you to understand that yarn substitution is super complex and that you do not have to go it alone. Do not be embarrassed to ask for help. Go to your local yarn shop. The owners and people who work at local yarn shops are a wealth of knowledge. It is literally their job to know about yarn, and you should not be embarrassed to go in and ask questions. For the vast majority of local yarn shops I have visited, you will meet wonderful, kind, and helpful people. And frankly, if you don't, take your money someplace else. But ask for help. The other thing is, I think it's easy to walk into a craft store, a big box craft store, and feel like there's no one there to help you. And I mean, honestly, sometimes there isn't. But sometimes, if you go up to the customer service or depending on what store you're at, the fabric cutting counter, and you say, is there someone working today who knows about yarn? You may find that there is someone there who knits or crochets and has a real wealth of crafting knowledge. So ask for that help. If they say no, then you still have to go it alone. But if there is someone there to help you, that could be the difference between spending a bunch of time trying to figure it out yourself and tapping into the knowledge of someone who's really got a big depth of knowledge. If there is no physical person to help you, a great resource online is yarnsub.com. That is a resource for substituting yarn. So many places have Wi-Fi. We have cell phones that have little tiny computers so that we can put in information about the different yarns and make comparisons using internet resources, even right there at a store. Also, Ravelry is a great place to look for yarn substitutions. They have a whole yarn section. You can find the statistics out about the yarn used in the pattern and then do a search on Ravelry for yarn with those same characteristics, you can add a lot of factors into your searches. The other thing is, if the pattern is on Ravelry, the pattern you're going to make is on Ravelry, go to the pattern, go to the projects tab under the pattern, and see what are some other yarn substitutions that have already been made, and you get to see the final result before you even substitute out the yarn. It is extremely rare that I do a pattern test and have all of my pattern testers use the exact same yarn that I did. And so that's a great first step to looking, okay, the designer used this yarn, but the pattern has been tried in these 5 other yarns. That would be a great place to start looking for a yarn substitution. All right, let's say, can I be real honest with you? I don't even know in where this scenario would happen, but let's say you are at a place with no internet or cell phone service and you are trying to make a yarn substitution. Here are my tips for going it alone. Know the original yarn specifications, all the things. Know the yardage, know the ounces in a skein, know the fiber content. If you can have seen a picture of it previously, or there's a picture of it that you can get good detail on, the texture of the yarn and the plying of the yarn, have all of that knowledge. Next, stay as close as possible to the original weight to yardage ratio and fiber content of the original yarn possible. Those are going to be extremely important. Then make sure you buy the right amount of yarn. I am going to have a printable with all of this laid out for you, where you can take your notes and write your specs and make your comparison and write down possible yarn substitutions, maybe even before you go to the store, to physically look at those yarns and see what colors they're available in or how much you like that yarn. So check out the description below to snag that free printable, so that if you have to absolutely go it alone sometime, or you're just an introverted person and you don't want to ask the local yarn expert, that you can use that sheet to make the best decisions possible. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know that this was a longer conversation, but I hope I gave you lots and lots of tips and tricks to make the best yarn substitution possible. The reality is that the more experience you have working with yarn, different fiber contents, different weights, the more experience you have, the more you build your knowledge. So it is great to take any opportunity you have to go into a yarn store, pick up the yarn, see what it's like, look at all the details, look at the weight, look at the fiber content, compare the different yarns, and store all of that away for the next time you are going to make a yarn substitution. Also, I really want to encourage you to swatch. Swatch for fun, just to compare, what does this yarn look like worked up compared to that yarn, and then make sure you swatch before you start your project to make sure that you're really going to love the end result. Not only is it important to meet gauge, but also we want to love the end result. So if you swatch up and meet gauge perfectly, but your yarn gives you a very dense fabric, you may say, before you make your whole sweater and decide it's too stiff, you may say, I think I'll make a different yarn choice. The other thing I want you to remember is, as you're comparing, do not compare your unblocked swatch to a blocked final result. If you are going to block your final product, if you're going to block your final project, make sure that you block your swatch as well, so that you can have all the information about how that yarn is going to behave when you are completely done with your project. I go deep dive. I'm taking a deep dive into Gauge in some other videos, and those will all be linked below too. Check those out. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you found this video helpful, I would love it if you would like it, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It is always my goal to help you grow confidently as a crafter, and I hope this video did so. Thanks for joining me, and happy crafting!